Blood of Dragons, Volume 5. Trust Your Nose. Chapter 1. Round 1. Keep your eyes on him, brother. The level of concern emanating from the man dressed in the full Nordic steel plate armour shaped into the visages of wolves was almost palpable, and had it been anyone else, it could have been described as fear. Of all the emotions that Vilkas knew that his twin brother Farkas was capable of feeling, fear certainly wasn't one of them. "Since when have you been such an old woman?" Rolling his eyes, Vilkas spared a moment's glance to the towering hulk of a brother standing by his side as he readjusted the straps, keeping his vambraces tied to his forearms. "Are you getting soft in your old age?" "Maybe, but that just means that so are you. Especially if you're getting so soft in the head that you don't notice when a man is dangerous." Of all the men in the companions, perhaps the entirety of Whiterun Hold and beyond, there were few who even came close to matching Farkas in build. Vilkas was average in height, and yet he didn't even come up to the shoulders of his little brother. He was the firstborn of the two, and even if it was only a matter of minutes, he acted as all older siblings did, confidently and assuredly in all matters. It made the fact that he barely even reached Farkas's shoulders in height all the more incredulous. Dangerous? Him? Maybe to himself, but not others. With a dangerous creaking of chainmail under pressure, Farkas folded his arms and scowled while looking down on his brother. Such a stance always managed to make him appear even larger than he already was, somehow accentuating the fact that the enormous Nordic warrior had biceps larger than most other men's thighs. Even his armour, custom built for him at significant cost, protested in the effort of keeping his strength contained. What was truly strange was the way he was acting, his eyes locked on and studying one of the day's petitioners like an ice wolf alpha confronted by a male sabercat. Vilkas couldn't see whatever detail was concerning his brother, watching the new petitioner step forward to the rack of training weapons and look over the collection. Axes, maces, hatchets, picks, hammers, and a full assortment of varied blades were neatly arranged along the rack, but the man had chosen one of the longer, double-edged swords for the training session. It was very similar to the one that was clasped by Vilkas's side, a solid, dependable Nordic broadsword. But as it was designed to be used in one or both hands as needed, it certainly wasn't an amateur's blade. This made the poor attempts to hold and wield it by the man all the more painful to watch. "Trust me, brother, my nose tells me you need to be careful." "You and your damned nose has gotten us into more trouble than it's worth." Despite his attempts to maintain his quiet, impassive intensity, Vilkas winced as he saw the way the petitioner gripped the sword. His hand wrapped around the hilt like he was trying to wring the neck of a chicken, the wrist locked into place and without the flexibility needed for any form of finesse. "I still remember those nights after you ate those juniper berries that you swore smelled perfectly fine." If they weren't in front of their shield brothers and sisters, he would have grinned at his giant siblings' discomfort as his mind dredged up that particular memory. He knew that Farkas could remember all too well the way he had practically lived on top of a latrine for several days after eating more than his fair share of unripe juniper berries. Since then he hadn't even looked in the direction of any sort of berry or food that contained them, whether they were the likes of pies or even the mead that used to be brewed in Helgen. Still, from within the giant companion's chest came a deep, foreboding growl. A clear sign of his inner wolf was lurking just below the surface. Just watch him. Turning to face his soon-to-be sparring partner, Vilkas could agree somewhat with his giant twin. He would be watching the petitioner very closely, as he was concerned the hapless fool was going to cut off his own hand or something. Despite the dullness of the blade, the petitioner was swinging it with all the grace and ability of a half-dead skeever. There was a legitimate cause for concern that he could injure himself somehow. Some of what Vilkas could only imagine as attempts to show off his sword play left several of those gathered to witness the trials failing to contain their laughter. It had been less than 2 weeks after the dragon attack, and the city was yet to recover from the event. The watchtower had been destroyed. Almost 100 of the hold's professional ferdmen had been slayed by the beast, which included a sizable number of the Jarl's personal retinue. And now it appeared that the companions were left to pick up the slack. Vilkas was no fool, and he knew that Jarl Bulgariff was not one either. After all, you didn't gain the epithet the Greater by leading your people poorly in such troubled times. How or why the harbinger of the companions, Codlac Whitemane, had agreed to the Jarl's request for their group to assist in training the city's militia, Vilkas doubted he would ever understand. He did, however, know that part of the agreement was that the companions would get first pick among the best among those that they were called upon to train. This meant that there had to be a way to determine their suitability, which in turn meant that it fell to the likes of Vilkas, Farkas, and the other high-ranking members belonging to the companions' inner circle to test those who sought to be warriors. Normally it wouldn't have been a contest in the slightest. Farriers, farmhands, day-tellers, and merchants. These were not the sorts of men and mer that would find themselves gaining membership into the oldest and greatest collection of honour-bound warriors in all of Tamriel. While many might deride the 500 companions as merely just another band of mercenaries and sellswords, no other organisation could claim a 5,000-year-old pedigree back to the first men who had conquered Skyrim alongside the mighty Ysgramor. It was a pedigree that the men and women who claimed a seat in the mead hall of Jorvaskar guarded very carefully, and ensured that only the truly greatest warriors would join. Today, however, was not a day for such glories and heroes, and Vilkas was left hissing between his teeth as he mentally calculated the hours needed to train the latest petitioner to be capable of cutting anything more than bread, especially by the way that his dull-edged iron training sword accidentally bounced off an armoured thigh as he moved towards the waiting companion. Okay, whelp, let's have a look at you. Just like the others, have a few swings at me so I can see your form. Don't worry, I can take whatever you have to offer. Feeling and ignoring the eyes of the more experienced companions watching near the mead hall's doors, he gave another calm, measured glance over his sparring partner. Whoever he was strong in appearance, and under the armour he had the build of a labourer. Perhaps a mason, stonecutter, or even a miner from the hold's quarries, but despite Vilkas's words to Codlac earlier that morning, it wasn't just their arm that made a warrior. It took skill, discipline, and technique, which this latest of the morning's petitioner appeared to have none of the three in any measurable amount. About the only thing that Vilkas gave the man credit for was his armour. It was a solid, dependable, and pragmatic plate that his experienced eye could see Adrian's mark upon. That, on its own, was a point in his favour. Even for a Redguard, Adrian knew her armour, and while he would never admit it as such out loud, Vilkas believed her skill with forging protection matched Elond Greymane, Skyrim's greatest swordmaker's ability in forging weapons. But armour was only as useful as the skill of those who wore it. For those in the circle, their armour was a second skin, and they knew what blows to let through and which ones to block or parry. There were far too many dead fools in Skyrim who learned the hard way that even ebony armour was useless if your opponent slipped a blade between the plates, or battered their way through it with a hammer, mace, or war pick. Judging by the way that the sword was held in an unsteady hand and his appearance, this latest of the day's petitioners was born somewhere to the south of the Gerals. His stance also showed that at some point in his life he had been exposed to Cyrodiilic swordsmanship, but it was so terrible that Vilkas guessed that he either had watched a fight once or had overheard someone talking about it and had since tried to emulate it. Whichever way, his grip alone was woeful, and Vilkas could see no less than 3 separate ways he could disarm him. Honour, however, demanded equal treatment for all, and so wearily he began the test. Shield in hand, straps pulled tight against his armor-plated forearm, Vilkas stepped forward as softly as a prowling wolf, his own training sword rapping against the wolf's sigil embossed into the shield's face. Even in 40 kilograms of steel, fur, and leather, he was whisper quiet, but his opponent sounded like someone had thrown an armful of pots down the stairs leading to Dragon's Reach. In 3 heavy, lumbering paces, the petitioner stomped forward, perhaps even in an attempt to intimidate, before lunging forward with his blade. Trying his best not to sigh, Vilkas slapped it contemptuously aside, treating it with about as much concern as he would have swatting a fly. The petitioner's form was pitiful, his technique non-existent, and while he could feel the rippling strength in the man's arms behind the blow, it had been utterly wasted and left him flat-footed. Metal clashed and filled the air with ringing impacts as he twisted away from a backhanded swipe so obvious that his adversary may as well have written a letter informing Vilkas of his intent. This was not how Vilkas wanted to be spending his days, especially not such a glorious time that began with the slaying of a Dover of old. Even though he and a majority of Whiterun hadn't personally witnessed exactly how such a momentous event had unfolded, they had all borne witness to the sight of the handful of survivors returning with the ox cart bearing the creature's skull. Many of the warriors sent to face it had died, and as far as Vilkas had seen, there had been only one unconscious figure being carried when they returned, and he yearned for the opportunity to face such creatures in battle. If anyone was able to accomplish such a task, it would be the 500 companions, and especially the circle with their gifts. All the while he was standing, musing to himself, the petitioner was trying his best to strike Vilkas down, which said a lot about his lack of skill and ability that Vilkas was able to fend him off without paying much attention at all, and being practically lost in thought. What was truly the worst part? The petitioner was just merely the latest in an almost useless batch of wet-eared milk drinkers. Only one had impressed him enough to consider her entry into the ranks of the companions, a young woman who disguised her ability with her beauty, and had almost managed to slip her blade around his shield and through his guard, a feat that even some of those within the circle struggled to achieve. Again and again and again, the iron training sword smashed ineffectively against his shield, and Vilkas barely even grunted with the effort. Most shield bearers and those who fought them knew that you had to get around the protection they offered. An axe was preferable, chopping the metal or wood apart like you would bring the mightiest of pines low. Otherwise, he had to get in around them. His opponent was instead insisting on using his full strength and body weight into blows that he must have been hoping would get through the shield. Somehow. There was about as much chance of the petitioner breaking through Vilkas's banded iron shield as he would have head-butting Winterhold into the Sea of Ghosts. Yet another poorly timed and wasteful blow was turned aside, and Vilkas moved, sliding his feet across the courtyard with only millimeters between the stones in his boots. Step by step, he forced his opponent to follow, keeping the advantage firmly within his grasp and controlling the fight. But other than the handful of parries, he hadn't even attacked. Instead, Vilkas pulled his mind away from the interiors of his thoughts and forced himself to watch as his foe began wearing himself down, trying fruitlessly to smash through his shield. Even his footwork was appalling. In the space of half a dozen steps, Vilkas had almost caused the petitioner to defeat himself by tripping over the cobblestones in the training yard. In any other situation, this fight would have been over in 3 moves, especially against the likes of bandits, or the dozens of other dangers within Skyrim's wilds. Had this fight been for real, and even against the lowliest of outlaws, this petitioner would have ended up gutted dozens of times over, unless they took pity on the poor fool or succumbed to laughter instead. Vilkas, however, didn't have as much in the way of pity and training. He was ruthless and exacting, and as such he could turn even the worst and least skilled whelp into a companion of legend if given enough time. The training swords sung as they came together, the petitioners being deflected by almost the tiniest of flicks, which left him dangerously overbalanced. Yet again, Vilkas's opponent had put all of his weight into a thrust that had left him wide open for an attack that Vilkas finally performed now that he had gotten bored. A flicker of movement, a loud crack of metal and leather, covered flesh, and the petitioner's hand sprung open like a Dwemer trap as Vilkas slapped Knuckles at the flat of his blade. If it had been different, and not a training bout, he would have left the man missing all of his fingers from his left hand, but instead he had to content himself with leaving his opponent's sword clattering across the cobblestones. Not that he was finished teaching the first of what he assumed would be dozens of painful lessons. He stepped forward with all the grace of a dancer, twisting ever so slightly before ramming his armor-plated elbow into the bridge of the petitioner's nose. Disarmed, knuckles and face already beginning to swell, the petitioner laid flat on his back, blinking away tears and shaking his head to clear the starbursts in his eyes and the blood from his sinuses. Vilkas had never been one for pulling punches, as many of the other testees who had come before him had realized, but it said volumes about this latest of petitioners that he wasn't unconscious, crippled by the pain, or choosing to lay down. Instead, and in a surprising amount of speed, the man had clambered unsteadily to his feet, pressing one hand to staunch his bleeding nostrils while glaring at Vilkas through pain-filled eyes. Well, he can take a hit at least, Vilkas thought to himself, crushing the urge to give a satisfied grin as the dropped sword was dragged from where it had fallen. And he's not willing to give up, or give in to pain either. All around them, the training yard was filled with dozens of witnesses. Some were fellow militia, and other petitioners laughing at the latest of their number to be humbled by one of the circle. Others were the men and women of the companions themselves, seeing if any of those present may become to be called brother or sister in their futures. The laughter was mocking and grating on Vilkas's ears, but not entirely unwarranted. Even through the training gloves, it was clear that the man's sword hand was swelling and making it supremely difficult to grip his sword anymore, and he probably couldn't see well through the tears of pain filling his eyes. It didn't seem to stop him, though, as he forced his wounded hand into a tighter grip, glaring at Vilkas and staring at him with a confident smile that was totally at odds with his appearance and level of skill. Of all the witnesses to this latest failing, there was one, and only one, who wasn't laughing at the situation. Farkas had managed to find his usual spot leaning against one of the training dummies on the other side of the training square, and for a moment the two brothers met each other's gaze. The tension in Farkas was obvious, as was the way he was leaning into the straw and wooden dummy to the point where the iron bands and reinforcements were creaking in protest. He had never ever seen his brother this weary and on edge before. One time, several years before, he had borne witness to Farkas beating a mountain troll to death on the slopes of the throat of the world with nothing more than his bare fists. There was nothing living in all of Tamriel that posed a threat to him, especially given their unique gifts shared among the members of the circle. But here he was, watching every move the stranger made with an expression matching a she-wolf looking out for her litter. "You have much to learn, pup." Carefully, Vilkas ensured his tone was as neutral as possible to avoid any dishonour on his conduct, or to reveal the amount of disappointment he had in the day's activities thus far. "But you might just make it." Chapter 2. Round 2. Sword gripped in a hand with swelling knuckles, face stained with blood, the petitioner grinned and experimentally swung his sword again with all the same lack of grace and coordination he had through the fight. "I don't believe we are finished," he said, staring Vilkas in the eye and attempting to knuckle away the blood that was staining his dark goatee. "These tests are supposed to be the best out of 3, right?" Internally groaning, Vilkas did his absolute best in keeping his annoyance from his features. The petitioner was right. While technically none of the others who had made the previous attempts had bothered to try more than once and accepted the outcome and the beating that came with it, this one seemed to be a glutton for punishment. 5,000 years gave birth to all sorts of traditions, and for a group that prided itself on maintaining such things and their collective honour, there would be many things that Vilkas didn't agree with. The ruling that all training, testing, and practice bouts were to continue until one side admitted defeat, or one's opponent achieved victory 2 out of 3 times, was one of the oldest, and needed to be abided by. Fine. There was no denying his wariness. He had sparred 3 others already in the past hour, and none of them had managed to win a single round against him. Obviously, the skull of this individual was a lot thicker than the others, but it would be highly dishonourable not to extend the privilege of a second thrashing to this jumped-up, ignorant, and foolhardy peasant. Rolling his shoulders and cracking his neck, he sighed again, not allowing the sigh to be audible to the opponent or any of the spectators. The worst part of this was that Vilkas knew that the petitioner's desire to lose again wasn't the source of his annoyance. Normally, he would have applauded such a drive and willingness to continue on against a superior adversary, but the past weeks had left him feeling penned in, trapped, stuck in a city on edge and reeking of fear of another dragon coming to burn homes and slaughter families. Vilkas wanted to hunt, to roam free and let the wolf within him taste his prey. But with the Valtheim and southern passes unseasonably blocked by avalanches, there was nowhere to go. Especially how winter's imminent arrival meant that large portions of the northern holds would be very difficult to travel. Under the guise of giving his opponent some time to prepare, Vilkas readied himself, readjusting some of the straps of his armour while he allowed his mind to wander. Everything had changed with the dragon, and while he would never admit to fear, he knew he was uneasy. The avalanches, the rolling, thunderous shout from the throat of the world had been a summoning, an announcement, a proclamation of something that hadn't occurred in Skyrim for hundreds of years. Dovahkiin. Every Nordic child was raised on the stories of the greatest of Skyrim's heroes, especially those of the Dragonborn, gifted by the gods with the powers of the dragons of old, and who ate the souls of great lizards. Dragons had been extinct for thousands of years, but the connotations of a dragon returning, the rumours of more appearing throughout Skyrim, and the shout that had occurred at the moment of the dragon's defeat was not a coincidence. There were some that believed that the shout was calling for the return of the Dovahkiin to face off against their ancestral enemies, but Vilkas believed he knew better. If the stories and rumours were to be believed, one of Jarl Bulgrif's retinue had personally slain the dragon, and was, in fact, a Dovahkiin of old. A legend in the making, that was for certain. Otherwise, the greybeards, the holiest mystic hermits living in isolation in their monastery at the throat of the world's peak, wouldn't have undone their centuries of isolation, especially not with a shout that had destroyed roofs and broken buildings across Whiterun and had been heard throughout Skyrim. Yet here he was, practically brawling with men and women who could barely tell which end of a sword to hold, with weary resignation. It was almost unfair, but he wouldn't slight his honour by doing anything less than his very best. The growing amusement from the crowd was increasing as the petitioner tried his best to hold his sword with swollen knuckles, laughter echoing softly at the sight. But just as Vilkas was about to commence the second bout, a voice echoed across the training yards. "Hey, Kaius, since when were you left-handed?" Among those watching, Vilkas's eyes are focused on the short brunette, who had almost managed to breach his guard earlier, and the way that she was casually leaning back in her seat. For anyone else of lesser discipline and self-control, it would have been highly distracting, and several members of the crowd were more interested in her than the imminent defeat of the petitioner for a second time. There was something different here. The other petitioners and companions were laughing and making jokes at the expense of the man facing Vilkas, but the young woman had called it out to him directly. They obviously knew each other, which was unusual. The young woman had a natural talent of a sword which was as impressive as her looks, but the man was about as dexterous and capable as a rock. "How else am I supposed to improve?" Turning his attention back to Vilkas, the goateed petitioner gave the companion a fierce smile before deftly juggling the sword from his left to his right hand. If I don't at least try, then I'll never get any better with it. Like all of the training weapons, the iron broadsword in the petitioner's hand was less of a weapon and more of a hunk of raw iron hammered into the shape of a blade. It was the sort of weapon that a smith, especially a master like Eland, could hammer out in an hour out of cast-offs and useless metal. It was perfectly suited for sparring without the risk of mortal injuries. Dull-edged, impossible to sharpen, and yet strong and sturdy enough to remain intact through the worst kinds of abuse at the hands of amateurs. It was only a few degrees of separation away from a metal stick, yet, before his eyes, Vilkas watched how his opponent grasped it, as though it was a custom, sky-forged steel sword made specifically for him. Farkas had been uneasy from the moment he laid eyes on the man, and now the wolf within Vilkas growled in warning at the changes swapping hands made on the way he carried himself. Broadsword now in his right hand, his stance subtly shifted, gaining a stronger, more secure footing, his weight lifting, and where there was clumsiness and ineptitude, was now a graceful, light-footed adversary. Something was wrong here, and it didn't take a warrior with his years of experience to notice it and become wary. Despite being the first person to have almost successfully gotten one over him in months, if not years, he had already forgotten her name. Sophie? Cypher? He had never been in the habit of remembering any of the new members, as a lot of them had the habit of getting killed in the first months, but there was something that niggled at his brain. Kaius. Where had he heard that name before? Shrugging, he pushed the thought into the back of his mind. Whiterun was a city of over 70,000, and it was impossible for any one man to know all of those who called it home. By all the gods, if the rumours of Whiterun being home to a dragonborn were true, then no one even knew what he looked like. Rumours being rumours, though, given another week or two, there would be tale of how the Dovahkiin was 20 metres tall, rode dragons like they were horses, and shot lightning bolts from his ass, no matter the truth to their existence. Of all the people in the crowd, there was one who reacted differently at the teasing words from the young woman. So focused on what he intended to be a quick lesson of pain for his opponent, Vilkas entirely missed the way that Farkas had straightened and was no longer leaning against the training dummy. In fact, he entirely missed the way his brother was staring in recognition and with actual concern on his face as Vilkas and Kaius faced each other down for a second time. All right, let's get this over with. The grin on Caius's face grew larger at Vilkas's words, lowering himself while readying his blade across his body and resting it lightly against his left vambrace. There was nothing to show of the man who Vilkas had just so effortlessly beaten, and Vilkas couldn't help but notice the wolf within him was instinctively raising its hackles. If Vilkas didn't know any better, he would have sworn that his opponent had been replaced by a doppelganger, swapped out by the gods in the moment between blinks. Obviously, his left hand was his non-dominant hand, but now, wielding the training sword in his right, all of the issues, problems, and terrible techniques were gone. It was almost like watching a cartload of painted ceramic shards being poured on the ground and creating a mosaic. Kaius struck first, moving onto the offensive as he had previously, but Vilkas was waiting for what he expected to be a strong, but ineffective opening blow. It was a similar technique to many of the others in the previous bout, a powerful, quick, curving slice that twisted almost into a thrust, and Vilkas countered it the same way. A flick of his wrist, the impact of metal and metal to deflect the strike, and a light step to counter. But in a split second of horror, the blade twisted and snaked as though it was alive. Before he even realized what was happening, he and Kaius had traded several blows, and Vilkas was moving very, very quickly. Instincts honed from years in the service of the companions were allowing him to react and protect himself before his conscious mind had caught up with the realization that this was not the same fight as before. The opening strike had been a feint, and he nearly fell for it, his shield and sword stopping the dull edge of Caius's training sword only centimetre away from the gorget protecting his throat, and it was quickly one of the dozen or more strikes that put him on the back foot. Broadsword met sword and shield, clashing and striking with incredible blows, and a hush fell hard over the courtyard as petitioner and companion alike watched as the two fighters ceased holding anything back. Vilkas was one of the greatest members of the companions, a prodigy, and equalled only by the likes of Farkas, Ayla, Skjor, and the other members of the circle. From the ash wastes of Morrowind to the rocky heights of the eastern mountains of High Rock, Vilkas had hunted and slain everything that walked, crawled, swam, or flew. Yet, faced with a man in recently purchased seal armor and wielding a crude trading sword, he was struggling. Somehow, it was almost as though Kaius' training sword was magnetically attracted to his vitals, the point and the edge weaving in and around his increasingly rapid counters, parries, and blocks of his shield. And Vilkas found himself gritting his teeth in concentration. His skills were honed to a razor's edge, his hunter's instincts enhanced with the circle's gift, and his skill with the sword and board, as his brother called it, was unmatched. Kaius was almost making him out to be some young whelp still wet behind the ears. The ringing of metal between them was suddenly and abruptly drowned out by a sudden and powerful roar as Vilkas shifted onto the offensive. Every vein was afire now, his blood running hot with the wolf, and despite himself, Vilkas would feel himself smiling. It had been a while since he'd been challenged, and Kaius was certainly proving to be one. Blows were turned aside or parried by Vilkas's blade and shield, while returning his own stabs, cuts, and slices that rolled together into a swirl of violence. Kaius, however, appeared to be just as adaptable and capable. Without a shield and reliant upon his slightly longer broadsword, he soon proved his agility and control as he not only ducked and weaved in and around Vilkas's attacks, but relied heavily on his armoured forearms to deflect and parry blows. Each and every time that Vilkas managed to break past Kaius's flashing sword for a lunge or thrust, it would be knocked aside, and on at least one occasion, Kaius had managed to slap the flat edge of the blade away with the palm of his left hand. Ripostes and counter-attacks flowed from parries and deflections. Stabs and swings would roll into each other's, and every observer was leaning forward in silent interest as they witnessed the two of them fight. Breaths would be caught and held, gasps of astonishment, or murmurs of appreciation of the displayed skill, but there was no cheering or chanting. Each and every single person present was watching intently, seeing something that most had never witnessed before. Vilkas was also experiencing and witnessing things he hadn't. Kaius' skill with a blade was superb, but both of the men were sweating profusely now with a sustained effort, neither backing down a single centimetre while circling the training yard. Several times Vilkas would have sworn that his opponent had overextended, or had left an opening for him to exploit, only to find that it had been a perfectly set ruse to draw him in. Other times, blows that he thought were set to be killing blows had been nothing more than feints to force him into raising his shield just that little higher than normal, or to deflect it further away. Each time he did so, he would find himself hard-pressed to keep the dulled edge of Kaius's training sword away from him. The water of Kaius's movements was flowing down and around Vilkas's rock of defense, every move graceful and transferring all the momentum and energy of each strike into the next. Such was his skill that he was able to harness the energy from Vilkas's parries and deflections and feed it into the next strike without pause. Soon the fight was transformed until it was a never-ending assault of twirling strikes, flicking stabs, and lightning-quick ripostes that were soon joined with fists and feats. Every part of Kaius's body was a weapon, and Vilkas was suddenly very glad he was wearing his full wolf plate. If he hadn't decided on showing what a member of the circle could do in full armor, it would have been very, very likely that he had been waking up the next day with a larger collection of bruises than normal. It allowed him to soak up the punishment, and allow him to use his slightly larger build and more heavily armored body to absorb the impacts from Kaius's increasingly rapid strikes of fists and feet. Blows were deflected or absorbed, punches and kicks were redirected onto solid parts of his armor, but as always, his own sword was seeking a gap in Kaius's defense. Neither fighter could keep up such a pace indefinitely. but the way that Kaius managed to block a downward strike of Vilkas's sword on a noticeably battered vambrace, rolling his arm in such a way that left Vilkas stunned for a fraction of a second too long. Kaius had practically managed to wrap his arm around Vilkas's sword, twisting it aside and almost catching the naked blade in the palm of a gloved hand while opening Vilkas for a repoussé. With all the speed of a bolt of magicka, Kaius's own sword plunged through the gap in Vilkas's defence, flicking his wolf's head gorget with a clink of metal on metal that, had it been a centimetre higher, would have resulted in a crushed windpipe. Even with a training sword, it was a mortal blow, one that, had it been a real, sharpened sword, would have taken Vilkas's throat away in a spray of crimson. If it hadn't been for his armour and his opponent's precision in purposely not killing him, it might have still been one, especially if Kaius had been any less skilled than he actually was. In that tiny moment of realization, Vilkas knew that he had made a mistake with Kaius. That had he made this mistake with Kaius in a real battle, he would have found himself in Hircine's eternal hunting grounds before he realized he was already dead. Farkas had been absolutely right on how dangerous Kaius was. No one outside the circle had accomplished such a feat in one-on-one fight for a very, very long time. As though he was reading his mind and seeing the fraction of a second's hesitation, Kaius continued, continuing his spin, and throwing Vilkas onto his back in a clattering thud of metal. The tiniest of hints of weakness in his stance had been taken advantage of, and Kaius had managed to knock him down by kicking his legs out from under him, with all the effectiveness of a Dwemer blade trap. The ground slammed hard into his back, knocking the wind out of him despite the protection of his armour and the layers of leather and chainmail. He had been downed, something that no one had managed to accomplish outside of the circle, and even then, not for months at least. The surprise hurt more than the impact or the wound to his pride, finding it slightly difficult to breathe from the impact, but not for a moment releasing or relaxing his grip on his sword or shield. There was a pressure, though, something heavy and weighted on his wrist, and a metallic tapping against the metal protecting his throat. Standing over him, blotting out the sun, Vilkas could see the enormous grin on Kaius's face. He was standing on Vilkas's sword arm, his own sword, tapping against the wolf head gorget as a casual threat, but also the ultimate sign of who won this bout. It is definitely the best out of 3 for these, right? Silence had descended on Jorviska and the training yards, and even from his position on his back, Vilkas could see the astonished expressions of those who had witnessed the bout. It had been over in only a couple of minutes, but the intensity had been shocking even for some of the more veteran shield brethren. No one was speaking. No one clapped or reacted beyond staring in amazement at the fight and its outcome. Only the young woman who'd come with Kaius was reacting in any other way than shock, lightly clapping in a seemingly sarcastic manner before turning to collect her winnings from her bets made with those nearby. A hand with swelling knuckles under a leather glove appeared above Vilkas's face, replacing the training blade hovering near his throat as Kaius leaned forward and offered him assistance to rise. For a moment his wounded pride fought with his wounded body, before he reached up and accepted the assistance with his shield arm. "It's been a few years since I had a fight like that," Kaius said simply, his grin, the same cocksure grin had been wearing through both bouts, remaining on his face. "Neither have I." The truth came out, and Vilkas spoke it without hesitation, looking at the way Kaius held himself. That was entirely at odds with his incompetent, uncoordinated mannerisms only a short time before. "I don't think I have ever had anyone trick me that well before either." "I will take that as a compliment." There was humour in Kaius's tone as he stepped away from Vilkas and gave him the chance to steady himself. "All warfare is based on deception, after all." "And the best techniques are passed on by the survivors," Vilkas replied, studying Kaius with a more practiced, suspicious eye as he returned the quote of Gaiden Shinji with another from the famed Redguard Blade Master from the First Era. "Are you fit for another bout, or would you prefer to call it even, with one victory apiece?" The light-hearted taunt, the grinning, confident smile on Kaius's face wasn't mocking or teasing in the slightest, and Vilkas snorted in amusement. Traditions must be maintained, and honour demands nothing less, he replied, moving over and standing at his starting position opposite Kaius, who gave a few experimental twirls of his training sword that had none of the sloppy technique from before. I am ready when you are. Excitement now was building, and out of the corner of his eye he could see the young woman, Sophia, taking bets from a crowd of petitioners, and even other members of the companions, including Ayla. Vilkas didn't want to know what the other member of the circle was betting, but he had a suspicion that the Shield Maiden wasn't betting on him. There was, however, someone else who caught his attention. Out of everyone, only Farkas didn't seem shocked at the outcome as he leaned against the training dummy. All the unease and tension had left the giant companion, and he was watching as Vilkas gripped his sword and tested how secure his shield was on his arm in preparation of the third bout. Vilkas, however, found himself meeting his enormous brother's gaze, seeing Farkas's wolfish grin and the tap, tap, tap of a finger against his nose.